everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of the Speakers Forge. Today is officially the first time that Dariel are hosting a live panel debate, and I am thrilled and so grateful to welcome all of our participants and our mentors and our entire team to this. For all the Darielites watching, thank you for listening in, and for jumping in. For all of the external viewers, welcome as well. We will be editing this and we will be sharing the video content later on, so if you have any questions, you are welcome to do so. As a start, if you have a question, you are welcome to post it into the Q&A, and we will get to the Q&A afterwards. We will also be sure to support you guys within that space. So without further ado, welcome to the stage, Alex.
Hello. Hi guys. So as Zanine said, welcome to the Speakers Forge. This is a panel that we're running around architecture. So just to introduce everyone, I'm Alex. I'm your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. I shoot HTML instead of webs. I would say that this sounded better in my head. I think it did at one point, but yeah. So I'm gonna take you through everyone's gonna introduce themselves. Rian, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Sure. Do you want me to switch my camera on, or we're just gonna talk through it, Alex?
If you would be so kind as to turn your camera on.
Cool. There we go.
Send you live.
Great. Hi everyone. I'm Rian. I'm an architect at Dariel in the office of the CTO.
Jurgen, if you'd be so kind as to do the same.
All right. Hi, I'm Jurgen. I'm a senior developer at Dariel for the past 3.5 years, working mostly in the team lead discipline. Thanks, Alex.
Jeff. Sorry, I skipped you there, Lafika.
Cool. Hi everyone. I'm Jeffrey. I'm an architect at Dariel. I started at Dariel about 10 years ago as a grad, and yeah, help out Dariel with obviously selling architect services, senior development, and consulting on new sales opportunities.
And finally, Lafika.
Hi everyone, I'm Lafika, also an architect at Dariel. I've been at Dariel for I think 5 years in a week or so. Also have been working, I suppose, mostly in the banking industry since I got here. Been doing some fun stuff.
Cool. So I think without further ado, let's jump into the meat of the panel. We've gathered a few questions, and I think the first question for the day is, what is a working definition of architecture? So I'm sure everyone here has strong opinions, and it looks like Rian's the first one who wants to express his.
So I think to give the architect's answer, it depends on who you ask. So some people have called it the most important staff, or the staff that's hard to change, or Ralph Johnson said that architecture is the important staff, whatever it is. To me, architecture is a big picture view. It's looking at a whole bunch of things, and those things can be software components, they can be business processes, they can be organization, your teams. Architecture is looking at how all of that fits together. And I think the one thing we can agree on is that it's not just a set of diagrams. It goes way, way beyond that.
Cool. My 2 cents on what architecture is I like to think of it certainly in terms of, if we think of a physical building, its architecture. A building has a design, but it also has architecture, and the architecture's goal is to support the design of the building. So the building's architecture is almost like the infrastructure of the building's design, if that's sort of something to make sense of. So it's big picture is absolutely part of it, but I think you can see evidence of architecture almost at every level of an application that has an architecture, whether explicit or not. So that would be my view of the definition of architecture is how, or the parts of a design that are there to support the actual design itself. Cool, back to you, Alex. Sorry, Alex, you're on mute there.
My apologies. That does cover the panel's working definition of architecture, and I think let's actually start delving into that a little bit. So the next question we have is systems involve in spite of design. That's an observed fact. How can architecture be harnessed to make evolution a design consideration instead of something that happens in spite of our best efforts? Lafika, you seem keen to answer this. You are muted though.
I don't know about keen. So I think Rian alluded to Martin Fowler earlier. But just to start off, I think he also continues to say that systems, or at least a good architecture, allows for a system to actually change or evolve over time in a not so expensive manner. So evolution, or maybe in extreme senses, revolution of maybe software systems, you find that it's going to happen that you need to change a few things. But I think at the moment, at the client that we are in now, what we've picked up is that a lot of the time, architecture, I think maybe it's actually an anti-pattern, this observation of sorts, is that a lot of the architecture is not, or at least the architecture in itself is something that is always going to be something that is forgotten because it was at the start of the project. So it does not evolve over the duration of the project with some of the additions and some of the iterative designs that, or at least the iterative updates that get to it. So maybe that is in itself somewhat of an issue, because the architects are only somewhat considered to be people that draw pictures at the beginning and hand it over waterfall style. So I think to ensure that maybe a particular design lasts over time, we just need to ensure that it lasts over the duration of the implementation of the project in itself. So the involvement of the architect in the implementation also needs to be something that we focus on. So one of the easier things to probably look into when you look at the details of the architecture is separation of concern. If you probably design a system in such a way that you have at least some sort of a modular design, that what we would probably think it's a nice plug and play thing. You can just take things out and put things in. It's a nice, it's a nice to have, or at least it's a nice to aspire to have something like that. But ultimately, I think it should be an iterative process, and the design should be allowed to change over time. I don't think we can design specifically for something that will live indefinitely. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Lafika. Jeff, would you like to express some opinions?
Sure. So my view on this is ultimately one of the complications is that it's always difficult to consider how do I refactor an architecture. So if we think back to my previous point where we talk about architecture as something that runs through the entire design, to refactor that could be a very complicated thing. It could mean, in essence, rewriting an entire application. But I think certainly picking up on some of what Lafika said, you know, if we design with things like single responsibility in mind, that would certainly make it a lot easier if one were to go back and rewrite portions of an application. Although people might take a consensus that refactoring architecture isn't a thing, it is something that has been achieved before, and in many respects is what an ongoing project actually involves. So we have an as-is architecture and we're going to a to-be architecture. So a lot of that might involve rewriting an entire application. But it is possible to evolve something as we go along. And in terms of making it a design consideration instead of just something that happens that we allow to happen to us, we can kind of rein this in by also sticking to things that are simpler, things that are more fundamental that we build upon, rather than making premature early design decisions or architectural decisions that might lock us into certain things. So that would be my view on it, is that it's a very difficult thing to achieve, and but it is achievable, and from experience the best way to do it is to keep things simple.
Adrian?
Cool. So I think to expand on what both Jeff and Lafika touched on, it's got to be evolutionary, because there's only so much that you know up front. And I think that's where an architect's ego can be a very dangerous thing. If you think that you're smart enough to know what this project is going to do over its entire lifetime, and you start making bad decisions early on because you just don't know enough, and you lock yourself into those bad decisions, that's where you can easily get yourself into a lot of trouble. So I think up front, you need to think about what the really big things are and cater for them. But you also need to cater for the things where you just don't know enough to actually make that decision yet. So I think there's a healthy dose of deferred decision making that goes into architecture as well, and figuring out how you can actually push things down the line as far as possible until you've got enough information to make those calls. And to expand on what Jeff was saying as well, I think in terms of single responsibility, you also want to try and decouple the things that have different rates of change, so that you can easily swap them out without basically destroying a whole system in the process, because you've coupled things that should never actually have been coupled together. And that is, the architect needs to be involved throughout the system. It's like a few of the guys have said, not something you just do once and throw over the wall and expect that it's going to be okay forevermore. You've got to stay close to it, you've got to pay attention to it. And it's not just how the system works, but you also have to look at how it works for a team. As in, have you put together an architecture that over time becomes difficult for a team to actually work on? At which point that's also probably something you've got to reconsider and see how you can evolve your architecture to make it easier to work with.
Cool. So that actually sets a good platform for our next question, right? Because obviously you do need to align. So what do you do to align your architectural decisions with the business requirements and realities? I'll give that one back to you, Rian.
So I think the important part is you've got to keep on talking to people. Like, you find yourself kind of bridging the gap between the business world and the technical world. I actually read a nice article that a friend sent me recently by Gregor Hope, the guy who wrote the Enterprise Integration Patterns book, who talks about what he calls the architect's elevator, where the architect basically features throughout the entire organization, from the C-suite right at the top, where strategy happens, all the way through to the engine room right at the bottom, which is where the work actually gets done. And you've got to be able to communicate with everyone sitting on every single one of those levels and align what they're looking for. If you can't really understand what your business is trying to accomplish, it's very difficult to build a system to do that. If you're not close enough to your tech teams to understand the constraints that they face, you can't put together an architecture that's actually going to be technically feasible. Because sure, at one point in your career as an architect, you were probably the kind of the go-to technical person who knew everything inside out. But the more you get into architecture, the further you tend to get removed from the detail. And to still work on the assumption that you know everything when the world is changing all around you, it's also a recipe for disaster. So I think the key thing here is communication. You've got to be able to communicate with your stakeholders, you've got to be able to communicate with your teams, and essentially be able to bring these two worlds together.
Jurgen, what's your opinion around this?
I fully echo Rian's sentiment behind this. It's all about engaging the right stakeholders at the right point in time. You know, your business requirements may be given to you in a very jumbled fashion, and it is up to you to also identify the priority sometimes of these requirements and advise the business of this. And as Rian clearly said, you need to engage at all levels of the organization, right from the C-suite to the people who are actually doing the work. How do you keep things aligned? That is with constant check-ins with everybody. Most decisions are also made, you know, in a hallway or around the water cooler, for example. So you have to be around and a people person to essentially integrate what people really want with the systems that you are building.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think obviously the communication theme has really come out very strongly. You know, you need to be able to speak to as many people as possible to get the broadest possible view. And to me, one of the other things that stands out is also creating getting as much time as possible to digest the scenario. So the more time you can give yourself to think about the problem space, to think about you know, what really needs to happen here, it gives you also more opportunity to speak to more people, to engage. So yeah, I guess the two key ingredients to me would be communication and time.
Cool, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Our next question is, how do you go about sanity checking the architecture to ensure you're not over-engineering solutions or solving problems that add no benefit to the organization? How do you keep yourself from building that ivory tower? Jeff?
Cool. So I think, first of all, I wouldn't exactly say I'm necessarily practiced at this or that I'm an expert in any way. But to me, one of the ways to go about doing that is perhaps to think about how if I'm trying to distill a design to get the simplest possible design. I think that's probably the essence to me that solves or is the answer to this question. So the more that I'm focusing on how can I actually take out of this architecture, or what can I take out of my design rather than what I can put in, the better. And another way to do that as well is to think about new concepts that you find being introduced. Is there a way of expressing them neatly within existing contents, existing concepts within things that you've already learned, that you already know about your system? So yeah, in a nutshell, it's keeping it simple and trying to express new things as old things if you can. If you can't, then perhaps it's something new that you need to add.
Cool. Rafik, I see you keen to talk.
Yeah, so this one is actually pretty interesting, because the danger with spiraling into over-engineering only lies when a lot of the things you do without collaboration, right? So I think a couple of the guys have spoken about how important it is to always communicate with everyone else, from suppose from the top of the business, the C-suite, to all the way through to the people that will be actually doing the work. If that communication is not there, and you probably want to do things by yourself, then chances are you may stand a chance of actually getting into this endless spiral of over-engineering. But also, I think the best thing is to start with an end in mind. It's always a good way to test yourself, to see whether or not you are on the right track. So I think the big thing here is to involve everyone, from business to the technical people that you would need assistance from. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Rian.
So I think to echo what the other guys have said, it is very important to go and talk to others and test your ideas. I think it's also important to play devil's advocate and argue against your own ideas. If you picture yourself as someone who has to discredit whatever you've just thought up, how would you actually do that? Because that helps you to find the flaws and punch a few holes into your ideas so you can address them. I find it's also very easy to over-engineer something, especially if you've got all this cool tech around you, and you've got all this stuff that is going to look very cool in your CV, but it's not necessarily relevant. And then you can easily go down that rabbit hole, and you've now already set this direction. So it's also helpful at times to take a step back, step away from it for a couple of hours, and come back and see if all of this actually still makes sense. I think it's also important to just look at kind of the context within which you try and solve a problem, and whether this project is, is it something in enterprise, is it MVP for a brand new system. I can think of an example where probably about a year ago, we did a proposal for a client. Without giving away too much detail, essentially what this startup company wanted to do was a broker-based platform. So something, if you think along the lines of Uber, where you've got this platform that connects clients and service providers. So the initial conversation, and this was very early day startup, brand new, didn't want to spend a fortune, untested idea. So the initial conversation was around building this Uber-like platform. And in terms of cost and complexity, that escalates very quickly. But then we said, what if we take a step back and just look at the context within which we're actually building this thing? Because it's brand new and it's untested, you're not going to have the kind of user volumes that actually necessitates having a full-blown backend. It's so low volume that you could probably test this by wiring up a front end that can send an email to someone sitting in the back office somewhere who can then execute on this manually. So just by looking at the context, we were able to go from Uber backend to something that sends an email. So that whole over-engineering thing was completely eliminated just by taking a different view.
That's really fascinating. Our next question is, to what extent is your architecture locked into a specific vendor, and what is your strategy to mitigate that risk? Jeff, you seem keen on that one.
Cool. So this is always a difficult one, because one always has to balance off the question, do I marry into a specific technology or not? And on the one hand, there are often a lot of benefits if you basically decide, cool, we're never going to move away from this technology. It can simplify a lot of the development, because basically if you decide you are going to not marry, then it means effectively that one needs to start putting in certain kinds of features, like perhaps adapters or bridges, some kind of abstraction that isolates a specific piece of technology, a specific vendor from whatever system that you're trying to build. In other words, you're building an adapter layer. So all of your code doesn't reference the vendor, it instead references your abstraction layer. So in some ways, you can think of it that all of those touch points you basically have to write twice. So that is basically the cost, is that you would need to provide a lot of work, or you can decide, well, actually, I'm not going to move away from this and I'm going to marry it in. That said, there are certain cases where doing this is relatively cheap. So, for example, you know, there's a lot of cloud offerings these days where, well, two specific ones come to mind. You could go with Microsoft Azure and Azure Functions, or you could go with AWS and AWS Lambda. So if one wanted to say separate whatever it is that I'm building from AWS or Azure, so basically be agnostic to that, at that point it's a simple case of, well, I can create presentation layers that when I publish to these functions, what I'm actually publishing is a library that I'm just binding into a specific function. That can come at some other costs if say your library gets very big, but there are ways of managing these kinds of things. I suppose that is basically my view of this, is that one needs to basically try and take a view of almost like a cost benefit analysis of, do I marry into a specific technology or do I not? So being locked in is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, certain things you will probably never want to change. Would you ever move away from Java? If you've written your system in Java, it's not likely. I mean, you would need other ways of getting around that, which might be, say, having a microservices-based approach where everything sort of, or your architecture would allow you to be heterogeneous in that sense. Yeah, so again, in a nutshell, I would have basically isolation layers, so bulkheads protecting you from certain amounts of change, and also try and make a decision about what I'm going to marry into and what I'm not.
So I agree with what Jeff was saying. Eric Evans coined a very nice term for it in the domain-driven design book when he called it an anti-corruption layer. So basically, when you've got something in your ecosystem that you cannot control, it's a good idea to put this behind this layer that you can control, the anti-corruption layer. And then on top of that, you can do things like, if you look at enterprise integration patterns, you can put a canonical data model on top of it. So now, regardless of what's sitting behind it, everything looks the same to your system. You can swap things out. It's completely transparent. But like Jeff said, that comes with a trade-off. And architecture is all about considering the trade-offs. So if you decouple yourself from a product, you can't actually harness all the benefits that that vendor offers. And maybe they do something that is really, really cool, and it's actually worth locking yourself into it. In a previous job, I worked on a very, very powerful data warehousing appliance, which used something called DSQL, distributed SQL, which is a bit different from T-SQL that we all know and love. And it was slightly painful to work with. And eventually, when we migrated off of this platform and we had to go and rewrite all of our database queries, it was a pain. But the benefit that we got over the years where we actually used this thing, even though we had to lock ourselves into it quite tightly, was amazing. And we could get all these shiny bells and whistles. And even though it was lock-in, it was something that was actually well considered and completely justified. So I don't think vendor lock-in is always a bad thing, but you definitely need to consider the trade-offs and think about which risks you are willing to accept. I think that's where I stand on that.
So as a C# dev, I just have to comment, Jeff, the downside is then you're writing Java. So anyways, our next question is, how much punch does a architect have over a senior dev? Jeff, would you take this, please?
Sure. So there are many ways, or many, I've spent many hours busy thinking about this, and it boils down to as well, what is your definition of an architect, which I think is part and parcel of what this panel is about. But I would say that given the sort of view of architect that we've taken certainly over the last few years, they are very different kinds of roles. So I would say that it's comparing apples and oranges in many regards. So in terms of the job of an architect, you're not really supposed to necessarily be focusing on implementation specific details. Rather, if you're working in a larger team, a lot of those details should rather be focused or focused on by rather a senior developer within that team. So when it comes to decisions to be made on, if we were to call it different people's turf, then yeah, the senior dev has more punch on their turf and the architect has more punch on their turf. So it's a bit of a funny question for me in that sense, because yeah, they're two very different roles. That said, an architect would hopefully be able to step into the role of a senior dev, although maybe they're not a very good actual developer, as weird as that might sound. So yeah, I suppose if we had to draw an absolute line, then maybe an architect could take certain design decisions as priority, but also the senior developer, having been probably more current in the development role, would actually probably be able to have more punch over the architect when it comes to specific on the ground decisions, I suppose.
Absolutely, Jeff. You know, it's always this back and forth between a senior developer and the architect. Generally, in my experience at a client, the architect is very detached from the actual development work that's going on. And the developers are actually dealing with the integration problems or poorly spec'd out stories, things like that, that ultimately an architect at the organization would have been responsible for, at least providing some of that input data. The other problem with this question for me is the architect generally on a project is responsible also, you know, for the technical success and also for laying out the roadmap of the architecture. So in some way, an architect does set the pace and the direction for the project, and the senior developer unfortunately sometimes needs to follow that direction. But I suppose I always encourage this back and forth between everybody in the team. Collective thinking is more powerful.
Thank you. So that leads to our next question. How did you become an architect? Jeff, thank you.
Well, I suppose the short answer is because somebody else said so. But I suppose getting on the journey towards that is, the first part is exposure to a number of different things. So one could also say that it's a natural progression from becoming a senior developer, but also a lot of the ways that we've sort of been unpacking career progression as a developer within the company at Dariel. We often thought of your career progression, one starts out as a grad and it comes from a very wide base. So people could have studied any manner of different things at university, or maybe they didn't actually study, but you come into the organization as a graduate or a junior, and you basically start working your way up the ladder, as it were. And at some point you'll get a promotion to an intermediate developer, and your goal at that point is to become a senior developer. Through this entire process, a lot of what's actually involved is funneling your career down to that, almost to that senior developer role. Some might even argue funneling down to the intermediate developer, at which point one might actually decide to branch out their career, because at this point, someone's got maybe 5 years experience, 6, 7 years experience, however long, and maybe they decide, actually, you know, I've done my 10,000 hours of this programming thing, and actually I want to do something else. So in many ways, becoming an architect is a something else. So not to say that I don't enjoy doing code, I really do, but becoming an architect gave me the opportunity to work on problems that were a lot more interesting than I previously had the opportunity of working on. So how I became an architect was I pursued interesting problems to solve, and I focused on adopting a lot of the theory around software development, engineering and practice, and yeah, through my career, that's where it led me, is to becoming an architect.
It seems Jeff has given us a super comprehensive answer. So we're going to move on to our next question, which is hopefully switching. There we go. How often do you audit and refresh your architecture in light of available skills and expertise? Rian, would you be so kind as to go first?
If I can offer one comment on that, I think the answer is not as often as we should, which is what Lafika touched on earlier. Architecture is seen as this thing that just happens up front. And I think that is a dangerous paradigm that we need to break. Because you do need to keep an eye on what's happening and how things are changing and whether or not your architecture is introducing any constraints that shouldn't actually be there. But like I said, I think in practice that doesn't happen often enough, because I think it's generally perceived as something that happens once and that happens up front. I don't know if anyone else would like to offer a view on that.
Lafika, do you want to share your view? You are muted again, by the way.
Yes, sorry. I'll have to agree with you, Rian. I think it's not, I don't think it's done often enough. And do you refresh your architecture with what you have, or do you refresh your architecture with what you hope to have? One would say you'd rather work with what you currently have and you know, not have at least plans that you cannot realize with what you or the current skill set that you may have. But I mean, it's always a hard thing to talk to because you at the end of the day want to get to a particular place with the system design. And the example that I would make with that is, I think we are currently building suppose a new payment engine, if you want to call it that. And there's many critical skills that would be required to achieve this thing in different facets. And going about, if you had to say, I'll work with what I have, then I suppose you will have some sort of a bottleneck. You know, so one recruitment person will tell you that, no, just go get the people that you require for this thing, because, you know, people may be available. So I'm not sure. I think it's something that has to happen often enough to meet a particular requirement. I don't think we're going to wake up one day when a system is working and then say, maybe we need to just refresh things for the sake of refreshing things. So it's always a balancing act to say that you just need to always go back to the basics, especially when you are adding something new to the solution.
Yeah, so I think first things, kudos to Rian for the honesty. Yes, I think he's absolutely right. This is probably not often enough that we do this. I guess the answer is, how often do we do it? Probably when we're forced to, if we're honest, because it's, and I think this is kind of a bit about what Lafika was saying, is it's not really something that we think about very often. To me, starting off with my understanding of the question, so how do we audit and refresh our architecture? That's really evaluating, is it fit for purpose? Is it working for us? Are there changes that we need to make? And I guess we don't think about that until it isn't. And that's probably not the best time to be auditing and refreshing our architecture. A better time is when things are maybe not on fire and we are able to better allocate resources to performing this. So basically nipping smaller problems in the bud and things. So yes, in a nutshell, not nearly as often as we probably should be. And yeah, I would imagine that probably the trigger there is usually a case of, we've got some kind of staff movement, in or out or whatever, and at that point, it suddenly quickly becomes apparent, like, hey, actually we don't have anyone who can do this for us, and that's going to be a problem.
Cool, thank you. So our next question is, there are misconceptions on the architect role. What are those misconceptions?
Sure. I mean, I can't say for sure. I guess some of them might be that architecture is two boxes and a line. Maybe it is, but I think there probably is a lot more to it. So maybe another misconception is that two boxes and a line is actually a misconception about architecture, is a misconception of a misconception. I don't really know enough to say for sure. But yeah, certainly I think one of the other ones that is a misconception is that it is the natural progression after senior developer, which it is absolutely doesn't have to be. You don't have to become an architect after becoming a senior developer. There are actually other routes you can go. So for example, moving into more of a sales or business relationship perspective, moving into an analysis role, these are all possible options for people after they have basically decided that they are done with being a developer, or once they've reached that sort of senior developer point, now they might want to say, well, where's next to me? So certainly a misconception is that architect is the next step. I suppose other misconceptions are that architects get to do code. You can, I guess, but unfortunately the responsibilities typically require that you are working in sort of a more strategic level. So you could be doing actual hands-on code work, but your time is typically more valuable sort of focusing on more strategic things, I would say. I don't know if necessarily everyone else agrees with that. I don't know if there's anyone else who maybe also has another opinion on this. Anyone? Cool, Rian.
I think there are some misconceptions and there are some stereotypes, like that the architect is this cruel taskmaster who sits in an ivory tower and just causes problems for everyone down on the ground, which is probably something that we've unfortunately brought up on ourselves in the industry. Because to me, a good architect isn't that kind of high and mighty ivory tower type figure, but I think that is what a lot of people perceive the architect as. I remember when I just joined Dariel on the first team that I started working with, after I started establishing a bit of a relationship with the team lead told me that they were actually a bit nervous when they heard that they're getting an architect. Because I think the architect might be perceived as this person who just wants to come in and change everything without actually seeking enough context in what they're doing, which is perhaps not a misconception as much as it is a bad reputation that we've gotten for ourselves. What I wanted to say.
Cool. So let's move on to our next question. In a RACI or a pyramid graph, where truly should the IT architect sit? You're muted, Jeff.
Yeah. So yeah, I think so. In terms of this, sorry, I'm just refreshing my memory. I actually read through the question. Okay, right. So we're basically talking about people who are responsible, accountable, that kind of thing. So in many ways, I think in many ways an architect obviously needs to be informed about a lot of stuff, probably about as many things as we can, because if we consider some of the previous questions that we talked about, you know, communication was incredibly key to the idea of being successful as an architect. I definitely think that I suppose one would certainly expect the architect to be somebody who would be consulted on with regards to a lot of design decisions. So basically, when it comes to something like, I've got a specific technical problem here, I wouldn't make an architect someone who's responsible for that. I'd rather leave them as, this is somebody who's going to go and I can ask questions about them. So certainly serving as a responsible, a consultative role there. And in terms of maybe the things that they would be accountable for, the architect is, I suppose, ultimately accountable for things like, will the application scale? Is it going to be able to handle the number of users? Is it going to be able to grow to the size it needs? Are we going to be able to achieve the desired uptime? Those kinds of things. In terms of the responsibilities, I mean, I would say that maybe an architect is principally responsible for providing direction on sort of design decisions. So yeah, so in other words, I will go and I will produce a diagram that is the advice to someone downstream, I suppose. Yeah, I guess everything else, certainly somebody to be more informed about, kept up to date on the happenings of things. So I'm less interested in knowing the details of how something that I've designed, or sort of given a high level design of exactly how it's been implemented. But yeah, my responsibilities are more on producing the documents and the specifications that will be fed into those. And yeah.
Cool, thank you. So the next question is, does the architect get sheltered by the team and kept in a closed box and only care about code fits, or does the architect start the project with sales and the BA and go all the way through the SDLC? Jurgen, do you want to take this one?
Sure, Alex. I think it certainly does help getting the architect involved in sales opportunities along with the BA. First of all, it helps the technical team understand what they'll be working on once they hit the ground, as well as it will inform the business people as well as the sales team what exactly they will be selling. It allows them to cost things appropriately. and all of that good stuff. Now, should an architect be sheltered by the team? No, I don't think so. I think he needs to work with the team and needs to engage with people around them. The first thing is to understand, what is the engagement that you have with the client? What is, your statement of work with the client? That in itself provides opportunities for architecture that the sales team may use for future bids, for example. So I think it's very important that the architect is multifaceted and is involved throughout the entire value stream, from sales to implementation. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I actually completely agree with Jurgen. I don't think an architect is somebody who should be kept in a closed box at all. I don't know how you're going to be able to engage with as many people as possible if you're sort of in this closed box, only caring about a code fit. I think you do need that very broad view. In terms of does the architect start the project, I think it's very, so I think one of the hats that you might wear as an architect is a sales support role, and certainly that might therefore imply that you will be there at the start of the project with sales, and basically be present throughout the SDLC in terms of, certainly if we come back to the previous question, there are certain things that you might still be accountable for in terms of that overall delivery. So yeah, absolutely, definitely cannot be kept in a box. If somebody technical is being kept in a box, I would say that that would probably be filling more of a role of a technical specialist rather than an architect, since in order to do the job effectively, one has to be engaging with other people.
So I think this comes back to the ivory tower conversation we had earlier. If the architect isn't involved throughout the project and they make poor decisions, they will never know about it and they will never learn from it. So I think it's absolutely critical that the architect goes along with the team for the whole journey and that you actually see how the architecture takes shape over time. I think that's one of the key things that distinguishes how a developer gets feedback versus how an architect gets feedback. As a developer, you write your unit test and you run your code and you immediately know if this works or not. As an architect, that takes months or years before you can actually see whether what you've put together is going to work or if it's going to blow up spectacularly. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily involved to the same extent throughout, so you might spend a lot more time with the team up front, but I don't think you should ever be completely hands-off in a project where you've put together the architecture. I think if an architect is causing pain, they should be accountable and feel that pain with the team.
Alex, I believe you're on mute as well.
Can you hear me? My apologies about
Yes.
that. So we did crowdsource these questions, and this is more or less the same question as the other one. So I think the only comments I can really make about this slide is pretty much everyone on the panel managed to somehow escape the dungeon. But our next question is, when it comes to software quality, does the architect lead the QA/QC department, or is that still the team lead's responsibility?
Well, I mean, so this is an interesting question in the sense that, do you specify as an architect the quality that the software needs to be? Is that your role? How do you even choose the technologies that are used to achieve a particular thing, which goes to probably the question on some of the misconceptions, right? So maybe the team lead or / tech lead, would be best placed to actually make these decisions, with the guidance of the architect, in the sense that, there's probably a particular quota that we need to meet, or we need to just be at a particular level with regards to our software quality. This thing needs to work ultimately. But I mean, there's industry standards, or at least tools that help with these standards, whether be it security, be it code quality, linting, and whatnot. So I think it's definitely a decision that obviously needs to happen in the team, but it probably needs to be spearheaded by the team lead or the tech lead in this regard. They would be the people that are closer to the work, closer to the review sessions or the code reviews, if the process is not automated. So the quality needs to be there. The automatic quality assurance needs to be there. But it's just one of those things that one of the architect would say it needs to be there. How it gets to be there is probably something that the architect cannot have much control over. So I would put this on the tech lead or the team leads.
Thank you. Jurgen?
No, I fully agree here with Lefika. And in my experience, also on a project I was on recently, there were multiple squads working on features for the product. And it was sort of like an effort of being an air traffic controller as the team lead. Although I didn't officially fulfill that role, that's what I observed, is you are constantly seeing what features are going into the QA environment. You're constantly facilitating the communication between developers and the QA team. It is the team lead's responsibility to ultimately know where you are with the project at any given point in time. That's my belief, although that does get tricky at some times depending on the scale and complexity of your project. But you will definitely be using an architect to perhaps advise the QA process. Perhaps you're building something that doesn't have the most intuitive user interface. You will be guiding the QA team how to initially set up those tests, but the team lead very much drives the departments to fulfill that mandate of doing their tests.
I think to an extent, I want to disagree with Jurgen and with Lefika. So where I do agree is that the architect can impose some of the constraints and set some of the guidelines and help a team flesh out how they want to test and how they want to break code down and how they want to do their CI/CD pipelines. But ultimately, quality belongs to the whole team. If you've only got one person on the team, be it the team lead or the tech lead, caring about that, then you've got a problem. And that's where I think someone in that leadership role, and this could be the architect or the team lead, has to instill this desire for building good quality software into the rest of the team. But they can't solely own the responsibility for that.
That's a very valuable point as well. Thank you, Rian. So our next question is a strict formal architecture process like TOGAF still relevant in large organizations?
So, having it be a strict look, I think a couple of companies have tried to implement or at least follow some of the frameworks, like your TOGAFs and whatnot. The question would not be whether or not it's relevant, is has it probably helped anyone, or does it help someone that follows it to the T? And a lot of the time it's probably culture that boils down to some of the frameworks not being followed in a particular manner. So on the one end, one would argue that these structures, along with enterprise architecture for that matter, are necessary. We have to have some sort of governance, especially in large organizations where you can't or where you don't always have a control of certain things. So what you'll find is a lot of the, and maybe this is talking to more enterprise architecture than actually strict formal architecture process, but a lot of the processes that are put in place are to safeguard against certain regulatory constraints. So for instance, if you're in the financial industry, you need to follow a particular, maybe be guided by a particular regulatory constraint. And if your organization is big enough, you probably at a very low level, maybe just taking something out, you need to have some place or some guidance that tells you that here's a repository of rules that we have, and this is the process that you need to probably follow. And some of these structured processes have assisted in these decisions, or at least in implementations of responsible solutions. So I think I'm going to be more or lie more on the fact that I think it is relevant. Then it becomes whether or not you follow it to the T or make sure that everyone in your organization is TOGAF, ITIL, or whatever processes out there qualified. That's probably a different thing. So more than anything, I think culture and processes still have to be relevant in organizations.
Cool. Yeah, I think I have a view of this, I think pretty much along the lines of something very similar to what Lefika was saying. Any formal process provides structure, and I think in a large organization, the complexity is that there's a lot of communication that needs to happen through a lot of different people. So I think following something that is more formal is almost certainly relevant to a larger organization where it can provide a structure to facilitate the movement of that, I suppose you could say, an IT landscape of sorts. So that would be my opinion in a nutshell.
Adrian.
Thanks, Alex. Sorry about that. I think in a large organization where you've got many different concerns at play and things can affect one another, and you've got governance standards like Lefika was talking about, especially in the financial sector, a formal process has value. I think where the risk comes in is when someone ends up being a slave to the process, and you end up serving the process rather than adapting the process to serve how you operate. A view that I like to take on formal processes, and it's things like TOGAF or looking at the agile processes or Scrum or SAFe or any of that, is I see it as a set of tools that you can put into your toolbox, but it's important to take what works for you out of it. So with TOGAF, you've got a logical sequence for how to approach things. You've got the different artifacts coming out of it. It says it might be a good idea to keep pattern repositories and reference architectures, and this is how you can do an architecture definition document. All that stuff is useful, but if you become a slave to the process and you do it by the book and you end up writing a lot of documentation because the process says you need it, but no one is ever going to read it, that becomes a waste of time, and that's where you end up serving the process rather than having the process serve you. I think, to be fair to TOGAF, it does lend itself to customization. It says you can adapt it to your org. I think often when it's actually implemented, people forget about that and they just try and do it by the book, where it does become harmful. It's my view on it.
Alex, you're on mute.
Lost. Okay, sorry. Our next question is enterprise architecture a thing? Should it or shouldn't it be? Jeff, you seem keen.
Well, I suppose maybe as long as there are enterprises, there will be enterprise architecture. As a short answer, I think certainly looking at enterprise architecture in terms of thinking about the flow of information and between all systems within an organization. I think this absolutely should be a thing. So as an organization grows in complexity, there will be more and more components being thrown into the organization. And I think if one isn't giving enough thought to how these things are evolving, into how the organization is evolving, it's going to run away. So if you don't pay attention to it, you have no control over how it's going to change. Whereas if you do start paying attention to these things, you have the opportunity perhaps to change direction, to go in a way that is perhaps more advantageous long-term to the organization. So should enterprise architecture be a thing? Yes, if you don't want the business to run away from you.
I think to get back to the point that I keep on hammering on is, yes, enterprise architecture is a thing, and yes, enterprise architecture should be a thing, but without any of that ivory tower nonsense. So I think as an architect, you generally operate within a certain context, and that context dictates the level at which you look at things. So as a software architect, you might talk about things like design patterns and how you structure your code, and this is how you do something in a particular language, APIs, etc. As a solutions architect, you might start talking about things like integration patterns, and then you get up to enterprise architecture and you start talking about things like economies of scale. So there are bigger concerns at play. I think it is important that someone is paying attention to it and looking at what you can use and how things fit together, eliminating waste, reducing duplication, that kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone with the title of enterprise architect, but I think it is important that there is someone looking after that. So someone doing enterprise architecture, regardless of what you want to call them.
Oh, sorry, I'm being too eager to show my face.
Yeah, so one of the earlier things that we didn't mention in the misconceptions is that an architect is a single person that does everything for everyone. Maybe which touches on the ivory tower discussion that that we've had. So a community of architects that exist across the layers of, I suppose, the structure of the organization is quite important to always have a particular message that is carried across, be it maybe a standard that gets followed or a standard that gets used. For instance, one would be PCI with regards to the moving of information across payment systems, whether or not you need to mask your credit card, whether or not some of the players that you interact with or share information with third parties, that there is it's quite a sensitive thing to just out of nowhere just write a piece of software that that achieves movement of money to another place. So enterprise architecture at least sets up a structure, or at least we would hope, that would facilitate the use of these standards responsibly. When we may be at the lowest level of implementers of whatever it is that we are implementing, when we need to implement something, then we would seek guidance in these in these forums. So I think it is definitely a thing. It should be a thing if it's not in your big organization. So yeah.
It's a very good point. So before I go into the next slide, we are going to obviously have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions that you'd like the guys to answer, please do post them into the Q&A so that we can start moderating and preparing for them. Thank you very much. So then the next question is, what does the architect pass on apart from documents? Jeff.
So those of you who know me, I do feel that this is quite an important thing. It's very important to actually perform or play the role as a mentor. I think it's important to provide guidance to other people on your team to help them become better people, to become better developers. And so I think that one of the things that architects pass on apart from documents is wisdom and growth to other people.
Jeff said most of what I wanted to say. I think the answer in my mind is practical wisdom. We spoke about how you become an architect earlier on. I think one of the ways you become an architect is by hitting your head many, many, many different times. And eventually you can start seeing where you're going to hit your head before you actually hit it. And I think being able to pass that knowledge on to others and offer some guidance and mentoring and hopefully prevent them from hitting their head somewhere along the line is also something that an architect should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would have to agree with that. However, over and above that, I think more than anything, I think what architects would pass on outside of documents and whatnot is, I don't want to say assurance, but it's the only word that comes to mind to say that the solution is possible. So you'll find that a particular business or an organization wants to achieve something, and in all, I suppose, ways that they can hit your heads against something. It's possible to see what could happen in that preparation, or at least that communication between the business and what the architect would express with probably a particular design. So I think it is a technical assurance of sorts that something can actually come out of a particular requirement.
Alex, you're on mute again.
Oh, blast. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much to the panel. That's basically the prepared questions that we had for you guys. I think the conversation has been absolutely fascinating. I know I've already learned a lot. I think so we'll switch to the Q&A section from the Q&A section itself. Maybe I'm floundering a little bit. So I think the first question is, how does the architect balance humility with assertiveness?
So I think this is a very difficult question to answer because from my experience, I think what happens, I think to a lot of people who find themselves falling into an architect role, a lot of your confidence basically comes from the knowledge that you've amassed over a long time. And it's that confidence that enables you or basically gives you the resources you require in order to make big decisions, I guess. So in order to balance humility and assertiveness, I think requires quite a lot of self-awareness. I think it will take continual practice. I think it takes a lot of sensitivity to other people around you. I think it's valuable to have a sort of people that you trust around you that can basically give you the opportunity to validate certain things for yourself. So, you know, I've certainly been on the receiving end of an overly assertive individual on the odd occasion, and it's very uncomfortable. And I certainly know that that's not how I would like to make other people feel. And the only way to know that is I suppose, to get opinions from other people. Do you make other people feel uncomfortable? So that would be my view of maybe how to do it, is continual practice and getting an outside opinion.
So I think it is important to seek input from everyone that you work with, be they technical team members or business stakeholders, and to consider everything that everyone has to say. But ultimately, at some point, you are accountable for the decisions that you make and the architecture that you come up with. And at that point, you've got to put your foot down because you are going to be held responsible for the decisions that you make. And not everyone would necessarily like that, which in some cases is unfortunate, but also as a team, and if you've got a good team, everyone will band together and stick behind the decision, even though it's not necessarily the one that they've made. I think that's an interesting part of the role of an architect as well, is you're a leader, but you have no formal authority. So to Jeff's point, you've got knowledge, you hopefully get people's respect, and you can use that to get them to buy into your vision, but you can't fire them if they don't do that. But like I said, at some point, you've got to put your foot down. With all the information you've gathered, with all things considered, it's up to you to make a decision. And unfortunately, everyone else just has to buy into that because it's your neck you're sticking out for it.
Yeah, I think the guys have actually touched onto it pretty well. So being in a leadership role, I suppose, does not mean you are the person that comes up with the bells and whistles all the way through. So collaboration is, I think, a big part of the architect's role, speaking to everyone, and being humble enough to actually be able to listen to people, or at least in a way that you would understand. Ultimately, the decisions we would probably think are going to be yours, but it doesn't hurt to actually get input from elsewhere. You would have a particular feeling about a particular vendor. Say, for instance, you want to go the SAP route and someone wants to go someone else, and then they might have actually very good input to that decision. And just being able to state your case, being assertive with certain things, but also being able to listen to get a different view. I think that I think goes a long way.
Just to add to that, I think ego can be very dangerous. And going back to one of the potential misconceptions of what an architect is, and I think this is one held by architects themselves, is that the architect is more important than anyone on the dev team, and therefore they get to steamroll everyone and make their own decisions. It's just not true. And I think that's where humility becomes very important as well, is realizing that as an architect, you are not necessarily the most important or the smartest team on the team, and therefore you've got to go to everyone around you and seek their input as well.
Cool. So our next question is, how important is it to be a good listener?
So I think we've already touched on this concept. Certainly, you know, the speaker spoke a lot about how important it is to listen. If you don't listen, how do you acquire new information? And if the job of being an architect requires, you know, getting as much information as possible, not being a good listener by inference means that you're not likely to be a good architect because you can't get all the information you need. So being a good listener, I would say, is really, really, really important. Probably not just for being an architect, but actually for any job. That would be my view, that being a good listener is important for any kind of relationship. It's important for any kind of work.
Rian?
Oh, sorry, I was not supposed to be on camera now.
Okay, wait, that's fine. So
Next question.
We've more or less run out of questions. I don't know if anyone else has anything, or if you guys have more questions, now is the chance to ask them. We'll give it like 30 seconds. But I think, like, whilst we're waiting to see if there is any additional, there we go. At what point do you decide to rewrite a system as opposed to fixing what you have?
Right, so this is really one of those judgment questions that's really, really difficult to answer. And I would say that the decision point to me would be the point at which it will be cheaper to rewrite it than it will be to maintain it moving forward. So it's a bit like, I guess, the idea of when do you decide to buy a new car. Of course, establishing what that's actually going to be is really difficult. I think there's a lot of different factors that come into play. So it is a really difficult decision to make, but ultimately I would say it's one that boils down to cost, but cost could also come in many different forms. So for example, you could be dealing with raw manpower costs, so how much time I have to pay for developers to do a certain task, to rewrite my system, or to make changes to the system. But there are other costs that maybe not be as visible, and such as opportunity costs. So if you're unable to provide the business agility that you need because I cannot make changes quickly enough to my system, that is maybe the time to also start thinking about, okay, well, maybe we really need to think seriously about how do I rewrite the system? How do I replace it? There, in my opinion, should always be some kind of business objective that you're trying to fulfill in making this decision. And that'll almost certainly boil down to cost.
I think the answer to that question would be, it depends on what your problem is with the system as well. For instance, there's a lot of platforms or web platforms, or at least organizations that are still running, let's say, very old technologies that do not meet the security requirements, or at least that don't meet some of the modern security requirements. A perfect example would be you're still running AngularJS when Angular is not, or at least when Google is not even supporting the technology in itself. There's no easier way to move from AngularJS to Angular 2 or even 8+ without having to rewrite the whole thing. So a lot of the time you are actually pushed to make those decisions. It can be pretty easy when you get to that point. However, I suppose in our world we are sort of always ready to change systems to the latest and greatest, but if budget allows is always the question. I saw a comment that says budget never allows, but it always has to. It always goes to the appetite or that the business has to actually upgrade their systems.
Cool. So we've got a few questions still. We are running a bit out of time, but I think so. The next question is from Yannick. Becoming an architect is trial and error, from what I'm gathering. How do you actually get into your position and attempt this, or to attempt this on a real project?
Yeah, so one of the comments that came through earlier that was, I think, added to the question of how do I become an architect? And one of them was the idea of you've demonstrated a certain level of trustworthiness. So basically, I think that's one of the factors. At some point, you've been given an opportunity, and every opportunity you succeed at is going to garner more trust with you, that you will be capable of handling the next challenge. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not like, you know, I said it sort of tongue in cheek earlier, you know, at the end of the day, somebody said I'm an architect, but you know, the truth is that one doesn't suddenly become, okay, cool, I've leveled up and now I'm an architect. It's a process over time, and at some point a certain amount of trust has been established in your ability to get there. So how you get into a position to attempt this with a real world project is basically starting small. So demonstrate an appreciation for those responsibilities through smaller choices on the project. So fortunately, the more senior you get as a developer, the more opportunities that will come your way. So maybe just, I suppose, as an assurance to people, those who are interested in progressing their career to becoming an architect, you don't really need to do anything as per se. You just need to carry on being you, and that is you need to just do the best job that you can, and yeah, sort of every time you get an opportunity to prove yourself, if you can prove that you are capable of overcoming whatever adversity is in front of you, that will garner trust. You will get more opportunities to do more sophisticated things. And eventually people will be able to trust that you will be capable of making sound decisions that are going to come your way, decisions that no one can give you the answers to, and you're the person who has to create those answers. Anyway, I hope that's sufficiently comprehensive.
I also wanted to offer a comment specifically in the context of Dariel. So we've got a very clear definition of what an architect means in our world, that the person who asked the question could go and look at, just to kind of see how far they are along on that journey. And I think something worth mentioning as well is, so trial and error doesn't necessarily make you an architect. It, I think, equips you to be an architect to an extent. And I think once you've decided that that is the route you want to take, try and get onto a project where you can work with someone who can guide you and mentor you on that. It's probably not going to be a case of someone is going to hand you a big system and a new project to architect right off the bat. but you could probably get buddied up with someone who can help you to do that and work through that journey.
So our next question is, overall, what makes a good architect? That camera delay before I can send you live, though.
Okay, so I won't actually presume to know what makes a good architect. What I can say is that I do believe that there are specific traits that are very important in order to be successful at doing the job of an architect. And probably, as mentioned, one of the most important skills is being a good listener. One has to be able to, gather as much information about as many different things relating to, however vaguely, to whatever project you're working on. I think other traits that are very useful are sort of a mile-wide sort of thinking. So being able to think that mile-wide, inch deep is something that's very valuable, because it also gives you a broad view of other things. So when you've gotten a lot of information coming in, you also want to be able to see out with what you've gotten. So you want to have a view of how are my decisions going to make, how are the decisions I'm going to make today impact other things down the line in other different places. So I think that probably comes down to the idea of strategic thinking. And yeah, other things that we've discussed, it's very important to be, I think, empathetic overall. One needs to be able to put yourself in another person's position to understand it. I think these are all part and parcel of other important things we've raised, like the being humble and things like that. So yeah, and I guess being able to make a decision is obviously really, really important. If you're terrible at making decisions, it's hard to imagine that you'll be good at being an architect. So yeah, I guess you need to figure out what you need to do in order to learn how to make decisions. I know that for me, sort of figuring out what was important for me in terms of being able to make a decision, having a conscious awareness of that was quite important. Yeah.
I want to say the right combination of humility, assertiveness, and having hit your head enough times, but also the ability to extract the general from the specific, if I can put it like that. So to extract patterns from things you've learned in the past, and to see which new problems that you're facing are similar to things you've solved in the past, even if it's a completely different programming language or a completely different system or a completely different business, but to be able to leverage off of what you've learned in the past and apply it to a new problem.
Cool. So our next question is, how would you go about auditing the ongoing quality of your architecture? And the AUDIT does make a surprise appearance, of course. Wouldn't be a good video call without those.
Yeah, I guess this is another difficult question to answer. I think, as has already been covered, it seems like none of us are really doing this as much as we should. But I suppose one would start by looking out for things that are pain points. So retrospective sounds like a great place to start. You can think about, okay, well, paying attention to things that people are talking about as having been difficult there. One probably would also need to keep an ear to the road, as it were, on changes that are coming from outside of your project. So, for example, you know, if the current OS you're running is going to exit support, that's kind of important. If a key component that you rely on is changing vendors, and maybe that'll have other knock-on effects to you, that is important. So yeah, I guess if I were to make a change, maybe the right thing to do is to start to make it part of a development cycle step. So retrospectives, maybe as an architect, even with your team, do it with your team. Why not? And if you really want, you can do it just on your own, I guess. But team sounds better.
So there's a book called Evolutionary Architecture by the ThoughtWorks crowd, and in there they talk about defining fitness functions for your architecture. So I think to Jeff's point, you want to get the right metrics out of it. And this could be something you go and reflect on in retrospectives. It could be something you pick up through your automated monitoring tools. You might want to look at things like how long does it take to implement a new feature? Is that increasing over time? If it is, maybe it's something the architect you should be looking at. You want to look at things like performance. If there's a gradual increase in response times in your production systems, where does that come from? Maybe again, you want to go and look at the architecture. But I think it's very subjective and up to probably the architect or the ops team or whoever is responsible for that in your environment to go and figure out what the right metrics are to look at and to constantly evaluate them and look for anything out of the ordinary.
Thank you for that, guys. So our very last question before we close out for the day is, with so many capable technologies out there, how do you go about deciding the best technology to build a system? Do you consider the skills of your developers or the skills your developers have, or what other factors do you consider?
So again, I would look at this, I suppose, in terms of trying to think about what is best for your business, the customer. So in some cases, it could be a case of you say, well, what developers do I have on hand? That's probably not a bad place to start because there's the resources that you have. However, you don't necessarily always want to limit yourself only to the developers on hand, because maybe the customer is prepared to source people from outside of the organization in order to fulfill a certain objective. Yeah, I suppose it would be silly to pick a technology that you don't know a lot about, which might open the question of, well, how do you get new technologies? But there are a lot of risks of picking something that you don't know or don't understand well. So something that you have worked with before is probably something worth putting a bit of weight on. And I suppose there's also, ultimately for me, I think cost is quite a big factor. So, you know, if all technologies would need to be considered in terms of their cost impact to the project. So, for example, one might say something crazy like we should write all of our code in assembler because it's fast. Okay, well, what is the cost benefit analysis of doing that? So it's going to take us a really long time now to build this big complicated system, but hey, it's going to run on the CPU really fast, but that's a bit moot because the CPU time is cheap. These are the kinds of trade-offs that maybe we want to consider when doing that. A lot of cost benefit looking at, Wayne made a point earlier, it's like linear programming. So you kind of want to find a sweet spot. Yeah. You're on mute, Rian.
Sorry about that. I was just saying, I think it's about the trade-offs, and you've got to be able to sit down and go, with all things considered, this is the technology that makes sense. And obviously, you want to look at the skills that you've got available. I mean, Rust is, I've never used it, but from all accounts that I've heard, it's a brilliant language. But if I've got a team full of Java devs and I've got a deadline, I'm probably not going to use Rust, because the benefit that I would get from having something that, for argument's sake, is going to run 10% faster, but I've got to upskill a team and it's going to take me 3 extra months to develop, it's just not going to be worth it. So I will go with the technology for which I've got the skills readily available. I think this is also where it's important not to fall into the resume-driven development trap. You don't want to use all the tech that's going to look good in your CV, but that is not necessarily a good fit for the problem you're trying to solve. And the last point I wanted to add there, if you've got a couple of competing technologies and all of them seem to make sense, see if you can take a week out and go build a proof of concept with each of the options. Actually try it and see what's going to work best. Don't make a decision without enough information.
Cool, thank you very much. You're muted.
Hashtag 2020.
All right, guys. Yes, and on that bombshell and all our mutes, thank you so much for joining us for this event. It's been great. If you do have any extra questions, please pop us a message. But otherwise, a huge thank you to Alex and Jurgen and Lafika, Jeff and Rian. It's been very informative, and I, for one, learned a lot. And I can't wait to see you guys in the next one. So keep your eyes peeled. We will be starting Dariel Conference officially as of the 11th of November, with the first edition coming out. We will be sharing invitations and information to that shortly. There will be more structured talks around our core values, and there might be a few more panels. So thank you so much and have a beautiful weekend. We'll see you all soon. Goodbye for now.